So Ryan, I'm so excited for you to be here to tell us about your creative journey and about, the Kickstarter campaign that you're doing for the book, which is called A Hunter's Tale. Is that right?
That's right.
And also you are a professor of illustration and comics, correct?
That's right.
And you have your own self-publishing company as well. So you just have a lot of things going on that I know people in the community are going to be super interested to hear about. So we always want to start with just a little background. So maybe tell us about how you first got into comics and a little bit about what you did before you got to the point where you are right now.
Jana, it's like you've read through my presentation already. I'm ready to go when you are.
Okay.
Okay, let me share this screen then. While I am sharing a screen, thank you, everybody, for showing up today. This is an awesome crowd. I see some familiar faces. Hey, Patrick. Hey, Lex, and everybody else. Thank you for having me here today. So why don't we get going? So I'm here to chat with you about this this new book that Jana mentioned, and I've got a few things I'd like to mention to you today. So here we are at the Kids Comics Unite Hunter's Tale book launch with me. And while I know some of you, I don't know all of you. So I thought I'd start with that introduction to me and then move on to my newest comic, A Hunter's Tale. And I don't know about you guys, but I'm sort of a process junkie. I love seeing how different creators make what they make. And so I thought I'd pull back the curtain and show you how I make a page of comics. And then I thought I'd mention where you can find this book as it's being launched. And I'm going to make a brief mention of my online tour I'm doing in association with the crowdfunding campaign this month. And I wanted to end by hopefully giving back to the Kids Comics Unite community a little bit, because I'm sort of a newcomer here. I've been part of the community for several months now, thanks to Lex. Lex, thanks for the invite and pointing me this way. So I wanted to talk about how to organize a tour of your own for when your own book comes out. And at the end of all that, I'd be happy to take some questions. So let's start with that introduction that Jana was hoping for. So my name is Ryan Claytor. I'm a university professor and a comics artist, and I understand how those can be kind of different hats to wear. So let's start with that university professor hat. I am a full-time professor at MSU, and I am also the coordinator of the Michigan State University Comic Art and Graphic Novel minor, which means I am the one who spearheaded this course of study into existence. And I also teach the comics studio courses at Michigan State University. I'm also the director of the Michigan State University Comics Forum, which is a multi-day event for scholars, creators, and fans of comics. And as of this point, the show has been running for 14 consecutive years. Every year, we bring a couple of keynote speakers, one award-winning cartoonist and one award-winning comics scholar. And we have a ton of different events associated with the forum each year, from Artist Alley with dozens of creators behind the table of their own work, to academic panel discussions with scholars coming from literally all over the world to discuss their research in comics, comics exhibitions, book signings, film screenings, and the proverbial more. Every year we add more and more to our roster. So I am incredibly proud of what we've been able to do these past 14 years. I'm also the host and producer of the MSU Comic Art and Graphic Novel podcast, where we interview different award-winning creators each episode. And I would be remiss if I did not mention the Michigan State University Special Collections Library, which is behind this unassuming glassed-in room, this reading room, but below that floor in the basement of the MSU main library sits the largest public collection of comic books in the world. I'm going to let you sit with this for just a second. At Michigan State University, we have the largest public collection of comic books anywhere in the universe. And it is available for not only faculty, staff, and students to use, but the general public as well. So if you happen to be in Michigan, please let me know, and I will point you toward Comics Nirvana. And I cannot mention this collection without also mentioning Randy Scott, who has made it his life's work to create this collection. He's been working at the MSU Main Library since the early 70s, and almost 50 years later, he is still working there to this day. And he is just an incredible patron saint of comics. So this is who we have to thank for that collection. So that's a little bit about comic studies at Michigan State University and the hats that I wear, but I thought I would also give you a brief history of myself as a comics artist. So taking a trip in the Wayback Machine to summer of 2003, almost 20 years ago, I was an intern at Marvel Comics in New York City, where I filtered around to a bunch of different departments, learning all kinds of different industry technical standards that I use in my work today and also teach my students at MSU. And shortly after that experience, I formed my own self-publishing company called Elephant Eater Comics. And I understand that is a bit of an odd name, and I get questioned about that all the time. Why Elephant Eater Comics? And it's based on a saying that my dad used to tell me and my siblings when we were young. He'd say, well, it's like eating an elephant. Just do it one bite at a time, and before you know it, you're done. So I always think about that when I have big tasks in front of me, be it going through school or making a comic or raising children or what have you. It's applicable to so many things in life. So I named my self-publishing company that to kind of keep me grounded and pay tribute to my pops too. So these are some of my very first books. It was a series of autobiographical comics that I was making called And Then One Day. And I was, at the time, hand printing and folding and stapling these. These are all hand screen printed covers on velvet paper. These ran from 200 copies a piece to 800 copies a piece. And to my surprise, when these sold out, people wanted more. So I took these first 4 books of my autobiographical comic book strips and compiled them into this perfect bound edition that you see here. And I thought I'd just show you one of the, dozens and dozens of strips from that book. This one says, every time I wake up, it seems I immediately wrench myself out of bed and go to work. Today, I woke up to the still silence of the morning sun and pondered the fleeting tranquility of this moment, then went to work. So I think you can see how I was really interested in panelization, and you can see this democratic grid structure that I set up here, where every single panel occupies the same amount of space for the first 2 tiers. And then that panel on the 3rd tier is elongated to the point where it's 3 times the size of every other panel. The text is set on this curvilinear baseline, all of which is encouraging you to linger on this moment for a while, just like the character. And then boom, right back to that democratic grid structure for the punchline. But not every strip was humorous. These were autobiographical. And so it just really depended upon the day as to what was being depicted in the strip. So here's one that's a little more somber. But parallel to my life in comics is my life in teaching. And I was teaching at a local community college in Santa Barbara, California around this time. And a job opening came up for a full-time position. And I applied, made it through all rounds of interviews, and I got 2nd place to a gal who had a master's degree. So at that point, I knew what I needed to do if I wanted to teach in higher education. So I applied to grad school and ended up going to San Diego State University to get my MFA in multimedia. And while I was there, I was in a fine art program, and I was worried that comics would not be looked upon too favorably in a fine art program. So I kind of set this practice aside for a little bit, but didn't want to lose what I was gaining because I was, practicing comics for the past couple of years at this point. So I gave myself an exercise to do an illustration accompanied by some text each day in a notebook. And I would take this around with me everywhere, from, the coffee shop to the mechanic, and even in my grad school classes. And when I was doing this, my professors started looking over my shoulder and saying, what is this? And I said, oh, it's this comics thing that I do. And they asked me, they said, well, why aren't you doing that? And I said, I don't know, because I'm an idiot. I don't know why I'm not doing that. And so it was because of their encouragement that I continued to pursue comics, even in a place that I thought might not be friendly to it. Again, this is almost 20 years ago, and the comics landscape in higher education was very different than it was today. So this material was still autobiographical, so I compiled that into my next book, which was And Then One Day #5, the sketchbook. And that led to my next book, And Then One Day #6, which was based on a lot of reading I was doing in grad school at the time. I was starting to question the objectivity of autobio as I was reading some theories, and ran across this one in particular that stated that autobio is no more truthful or valid than fiction, which got me thinking, well, what could I do to make autobiography any more objective than it already is? So I started conducting interviews with a bunch of different people in my life, everyone from longtime friends, new acquaintances, parents, teachers, and yes, even ex-girlfriends, and started asking them questions about me in an effort to make autobio a little more objective. So I transcribed those interviews into comic book form, and they ended up looking something like this. So this is a longtime friend of mine. His name is Rhett. And when he said that, so these interviews were conducted in an isolated room via a box of flashcards, so that there was no one else around. And it was interesting to see how these interviewees just kind of forgot that they were being recorded. So I never heard one of my best friends say this before. And he said, when Ryan first started doing cartoons, I was like, oh, Jesus Christ, you got to be kidding me. Didn't you grow out of that crap when you were 12 years old, like the rest of us? But now that I have his books, I definitely do look at it more as an art form. I mean, because it's telling his life story through art and words. So I think I definitely have more respect for it now than when I first saw it. So this was actually really gratifying for me to hear as a cartoonist, because here's this person in my life that had a particular opinion about this medium that's near and dear to me. And then after experiencing some of these books I was creating, had this grassroots mind shift. What's more powerful than that? So there were a lot of different responses. I won't read you anymore for the sake of time, but I think you can see how this book kind of became a hybrid of autobiography and documentary when it was complete. So this was done during my graduate school work. And after this project, I still had a lot of questions about autobiography, autobio theory, and how it related to comics. And that led into my next few books, which collectively are titled Autobiographical Conversations. And essentially, I made an independent studies with a graduate professor of mine to record our conversations about autobio theory and how they relate to comics. And over the next few years, I produced these 3 books. And as you can see, I was kind of trying to visualize some of these ideas I had about autobiography that I was, wading through all these theoretical texts, but I wanted it to be more accessible to people than all the work I was having to go through. So you can see in these panels, I say, I've also come across theories which state that autobio is no more truthful or valid than fiction. So really, I guess you could say it's just a big continuum ranging from truth to fiction, and there's never any absolute. I don't think autobio will ever sit on either extreme of the spectrum. It's never pure truth, and on the other hand, it's never pure fiction. So in addition to making these ideas more accessible and visual for a visual learner like myself, I was also really trying to push myself with this project toward looking at environments more. In my past work, I felt like that was kind of lacking. So I really kind of put my head down and started working on perspective and environments, because not only did I need work on them, but also this work is a weird little book. You know, this is a book about autobiographical theory as it relates to comics in comic book form. And I really wanted to capture some of these quintessentially 1970s California architecture, university environments, like these you know, banners that are hanging that all universities have to tout their greatness, you know, different weird public sculptures that you see at a university, so that instantly you could see visually, all right, this comic is a little bit different. So also during grad school, I launched on an in-store signing tour. And I understand this is not a book, but I promise you this will come back into play later on in the presentation. And on this tour, I stopped at 50 different places in 18 states and 2 Canadian provinces. And essentially what you're looking at right here is my summer vacation between years of grad school. So this is what I did with my summer break, was to sell a bunch of my comics. And shortly after that, when I returned, I met my soon-to-be wife. This is Candace, and we hit it off to the point where months later, she is the one who got a full-time position at Michigan State University, and we decided to move across the country together. So while we were moving, I said, well, why not turn this move into a tour? So I hit a few more states. And then a couple years following, I did a tour of the Northeast and the Southeast, to the point where I've now signed my books in over 100 different stores in all 48 contiguous states. So I mention all that because it's going to come back in a little bit. So foreshadowing, we'll be back to that. The very next year, Candace and I got married. She was not frightened by all this comic making and touring. So we got hitched, and for our wedding, I made my next book, which we wrote together. It's called Better Together. And it's a little 8-page full color comic. And this was the leave behind gift for the guests at our wedding. It's also the first time I worked in full color, and I just adored working in color after this project. So after our wedding, I revisited those 3 books, which were always meant to be a single compiled version. I released them in a serialized version annually so that people wouldn't forget that I existed. But I started duotoning those pages for the final collected version to give it a greater depth of field and better highlighting. And you can see some of those comparisons here. And in 2013, I ran a crowdfunding campaign successfully to print that collected version. And also, at the very same time that crowdfunding campaign was happening, I became a father right in the middle of the campaign. So this is our young son, Owen, and he is now 8 years old today. And we've been having a bunch of adventures in life ever since. And I bring up this photo in particular because we love pinball. I love pinball. And the love of this hobby influenced my work in a really heavy way, to the point where not only was I playing pinball and going to pinball conventions, I was also purchasing pinball machines, because another thing we have in Michigan is basements. So now this is ours, where I've got a couple games. And this all led to my next book, which is Coin Op Carnival #1. This was published in 2019, and Coin Op Carnival was created by not only myself, but my best bud, Nick Baldridge. And it's about electromechanical gaming and sort of a celebration thereof. And that means old pinball and arcade games that were manufactured prior to 1978, prior to the advent of printed circuit boards and television screens being used in coin op gaming. So we co-wrote this book together, and I illustrated the entire thing. We call it an illustrated magazine because we're not sure what else to call it. There's a bunch of articles. It's full color, 64 pages. Every single page has illustrations on it, if not full-blown comics. I'd say about 20% of the publication is actual comics pages, like the introduction that you see on the left, and this story about Wayne Nyans, the most prolific pinball designer of all time, and his exit from Western Equipment and Supply Company and moving over to Gottlieb, where he worked for the next 40 years. So we also did a tour. The best two working dads can tour. We hit several different stops in a number of different states over the course of 2019, thankfully right before the world shut down. So we got noticed to the point where we garnered the top prize in the Small Press and Alternative Comics Expo Space Prize presentation for first place in the graphic novel category. And we even garnered a couple of nominations from some other industry awards as well. So really proud of that publication. But that brings us to my newest book, which is A Hunter's Tale. So A Hunter's Tale was actually not written by me. This was written by my grandfather, Charles Kermit Claytor, and it was a poem that he wrote almost 40 years ago at this point. And my grandfather was a really incredible guy. He was a railroad dispatcher and an expert marksman, but also left behind this body of poetry. And this particular poem always just stops me dead in my tracks when I read it. You know, reading through a collection of his work, this is where I always stop. And it's about these two disparate subjects, a hunter and his prey, who find this unlikely understanding of one another. And at its core, it's about reciprocated empathy, which I think is so incredibly important, especially in the time we're living in right now. You know, this was one of the catalysts for making this book, was experiencing life over the course of the pandemic, when, you know, we've all been through these things that I probably don't even have to mention, you know, insurrection at the Capitol, to George Floyd, to, you know, living in a time when we don't have to listen to anybody that thinks differently than we do. It's so easy to defriend and segregate ourselves into a place where people only think like we do. And I think that's so dangerous. And so over the course of the past half a year, I've been adapting this poem into comic book form. And I wanted to tell you a little bit about my grandfather before I tell you a little bit more about this poem. So I am not a hunter. I have never hunted. I've never intentionally killed an animal, but my grandfather was a hunter. And I almost skipped right past this poem the first time I read it. I'm like, I don't know if I can go here. But when I understand how my grandfather grew up, it makes a lot more sense in my mind. So my grandfather was born in the early part of the 20th century. And when he was young, about the age of 19, he contracted tuberculosis, which at the time was essentially a death sentence. And the only known cure for it was to move to a dry climate in hopes that the dry air would dry out the TB. So that's what they told him to do. He was living in a Midwestern town named Alma, Illinois, and they said, go out to the deserts of Arizona and cross your fingers that that does the trick. Who knows? But essentially, he was kind of sent out there to die. And because I'm here, I guess you can surmise that he made it through. And but while he was out there, all he had was a .22 rifle to survive with. And he could only capture his food with one shot, because if he took a second shot, then the local game warden would understand where he was living on the land when that was illegal, and they would bring him in out of that dry desert climate, which is what he needed to survive. So, you know, if I put myself in those shoes, I would probably do the same thing. So anyway, I wanted to share a little bit about my grandfather, who lived a really storied life, and I'm so proud to be collaborating with on this project. You know, I remember lots of good times with my grandfather, and you know, I also remember him as being a very funny fellow. He was always joking and cracking himself up and cracking up people around him too. I love this picture of him, you know, cracking up all the gals around him. So anyway, this is my grandfather who wrote A Hunter's Tale. And this is the collection of poetry that he left behind. This was self-published, boutique published by his church in 1990. So, almost 30 years ago, this was published. And this is where I revisit this poem on many occasions. And over the course of the past year, I've converted that poem into comics form, and I'd like to read a little bit of it to you right now. So this is the first page of the poem, this establishing shot splash page of what I remember as my grandfather's cabin in the woods. I've visited this cabin many times as a young sprout and inner tube down that river that's right next to it. And yeah, so anyway, here we go, page 1. And on the next page, you can see the sun rising and just peeking into the windows. And as it continues to rise in that second tier, it, hits him in the face and he starts waking up, puttering around, moving toward the kitchen where he gets some water on the stove, heated up for a cup of tea or a cup of coffee for the day. At which point you can see the poem begin. And it says, "One day I thought that I'd go hunting. It was a cold and frosty morn. I put on my orange blaze cap and gloves and coat and wrapped around my neck some orange blaze bunting. People call this thing around my neck a scarf, but my dog just calls it arf, arf, arf. I took a pack upon my back, and in the pack I took water, shells, a rope, a knife, and a sandwich for a snack. Then gallantly I took up my gun and went on my merry way. When I had walked a mile or 2, or 3 or 4, or maybe more, I saw an antlered deer beneath a tree. He did not move, he just stood and looked at me. He had a splendid rack, and I thought how proud I'd be to have that rack tied to my pack upon my back." All right, that's all you get. So the book itself is 32 pages. And like I said, I'd like to talk about my process for making a page of comics, because I always love finding out about how other people make comics, or anything for that matter. So let's take one of those pages that we just saw, like page number 2, for example. So I'll start with a script. In this case, it was my grandfather's poem. And so that was kind of taken care of at that point. But as I'm moving toward making a page, I'll start with these really awful thumbnail sketches for what I think might go on the page. Like, how many panels are there going to be? Which is the biggest one on the page? What's most important? How do I want to divide up these moments? And from here, I can kind of get a sense of panelization and page layout. So I'll take this very rough panelization version and take it into a vector art program like Adobe Illustrator, where I will create in a much more precise way the page dimensions and the panel borders. And if there's any speech balloons, I'll include those too. So from here, I'll import this digital version into, well, actually, first of all, I wanted to sort of break down that vector layout first. So I will start with a template of the page itself, just the page outline and then the panel border outline. And then over to the right-hand side, I'll have these little templatized versions of gutters that I can copy and paste and move into place to really quickly lay out a page. And if I need a little more accuracy in terms of how these panels are laid out, for example, if I need equally spaced tiers or equally spaced panels, I have these above and to the left where I can just immediately drag into place, like you've seen me do right here for these 3 equally spaced panels. So once I do this, then I can chop it up with a Pathfinder tool, and I'm just left with the panels themselves. So then I'll take this into a digital penciling program. I use Clip Studio Paint. And at this point, I will end up with something that looks like this, getting closer to a little more realized version. But I wanted to take a moment here to highlight some of my inadequacies. I went to school for a fine art program, which is not a practical based program. Like I did not have many classes in figure drawing or proportion or environments or things like that. And so a lot of this is stuff that I feel like I've had to pick up along the way and sort of find ways to continue educating myself. And one of the things I have difficulty with are different body postures, like this one that you see down here, where I had my grandpa walking along a hallway and kind of shouldering his robe on as he starts the morning. And so I took a photographic reference for that. Only when I took this picture, it wasn't the angle that I needed. And so I asked my son, hey, Owen, would you mind taking a picture of daddy? And so here is Owen's picture of me. And it wasn't facing the way I needed it to. I really wanted that path of motion moving from left to right to keep that path of read going the way I wanted it to. So flip that around in Photoshop. And I think you can see the mild resemblance from photographic reference to penciled version. So once the penciled version is done, I will convert this to blue line and then print it out on Bristol, where I will then hand ink everything: panel borders, characters, environments, text, speech balloons. The whole thing is hand inked. And then I will scan that back into the computer, threshold out all those blue lines to make it, nice black and white line art. And then I'll send this off to a flatter, which is the one part of my process that I've finally relinquished to someone else. And then when I get these flats back, then I will make it into the final colored version and do that umpteen more times. And then I've got a finished book, which is now live on Kickstarter. So that brings us to the next part, which I wanted to mention. This is where I'm launching this book, is on Kickstarter right now. So you can head over to the page at ahunterstale.com. ahunterstale.com will take you directly to the Kickstarter campaign, which is live right now and going really well. We're closing in on 300 backers, and I am ecstatic about how this is turning out. And I thought I'd also walk you through a little bit about what you can find there. I've got tiers ranging from $5 to $400 and everything in between. So I think you can find something that might suit your interests there. So a digital version of this book, you can walk out the door for $5. But I also have a physical version of the book for $10, which also includes free US shipping. So I don't know how familiar each of you are with the Kickstarter platform, but I do not remember the last time I saw a 32-page full color comic book for $10, even without shipping, but with shipping included. So I'm really trying my very best to make a very easy access point for anybody who might have a passing interest in checking out this book. So there's the physical tier, but we've also got next tier up, which includes a signature on the book, as well as a couple of limited edition prints. There's a retailer tier as well. And I wanted to take a second here too and highlight this particular tier, because this was suggested to me by one of my super readers. His name is Paul Patty, and I have a group of readers that are very interested in my work. I call them the Elephant Eater Champions, and we meet periodically, and they get early access to my stuff and freebies, and I get a discussion with them about my work. And one of the things that came out of that discussion was Paul asking me, hey, Ryan, you're working on this Kickstarter thing. Have you ever thought about doing a book club reward? And I said, well, what do you mean? What would that be? And he said, well, we're living in this age of ultimate accessibility where, back in my day, I wouldn't dream of talking with my hero cartoonist. But now you have the opportunity to let your readers access you. So maybe you could think about making a presentation, presenting it to a select number of people, having a discussion afterwards. And that's exactly what this book club tier is all about. So in addition to that limited experience, I'm limiting it to only 10 backers. You also get the signed book and the prints. And then I'm also offering original artwork, which, as you saw, there is physical art from every single page in this book. And every single page is available for a reward tier, as well as the cover itself. So that's a little bit about the Kickstarter campaign for A Hunter's Tale. But the this Kickstarter campaign, it's a crowdfunding campaign, and you don't have a crowdfunding campaign if you don't bring a crowd, which is what I want to talk about next. So one of the ways I am trying to bring a crowd to this crowdfunding campaign is by making a lot of noise about the fact that this new book is out in the world now. And that's coming in the form of an online tour. So here we are on January 19th, and I am talking with you at the Kids Comics Unite book launch for this. And I'm really proud to have KCU as a part of my tour. So I think this is a really incredible way that you can let a lot of people know about the book that you are making as well. And a couple things that I wanted to mention here. One, I'm not just scheduling these interviews with different media outlets. I'm also creating, as you saw, an entire tour graphic. It's one thing to say, hey, I'm doing a tour and I'm talking with a lot of people. It's another thing to have something that you can post on social media with this big wall of engagements. So people see you mean business. And of course, at the bottom of that is the URL. So you're never without an arrow pointing to where people should be going. Okay. So with all that said, I wanted to take this last portion to talk about how you might go about organizing something like this. I've had a number of people ask me since I presented this to the public at the beginning of this month, oh my gosh, how are you even doing this? Well, the first secret is that I'm not talking to people live every single day. KCU is one of the few exceptions for that. Most of the interviews I did were conducted in advance and scheduled to release on particular days. So how do you start making something like this for yourself? Well, as I said, I did not start by doing a 31 stop and 31 day tour. Like I've done this a number of times before. So I kind of worked up to Mount Crazy, as I call it, which is this tour that I'm on right now. First of all, you should decide on a period of time that this is going to take place in a couple of different ways. One, for me, it was a Kickstarter campaign that was going to last a month, but also what is a period of time that you can dedicate to a project like this? Like maybe you have a long weekend that you can either go somewhere in person if you feel safe doing that, or conduct interviews that will be released during this particular time that will release online. Or maybe you have a week's vacation coming up and you're able to dedicate that entire time to signings or interviews. Or maybe you have a Kickstarter campaign that lasts an entire month. Whatever it is, the first thing you should do when starting a tour is figure out a time period. So once you have that, I would start contacting friendly folks, familiar stores, people that you know, so that you can get some anchors for your tour. So I'm guessing that if you make comics and you enjoy comics, you've probably got a relationship with your local store. Also, local places love local folks done good, right? Like my local library has featured me on their podcast. Our local arts and entertainment magazine that's put out, in a 30,000 copy circulation, featured my artwork on their cover recently and did a cover story about me. So get some friendly, familiar media outlets and stores under your belt first. Those friendly faces will go a long way in the long run, and I'll talk about that here in a minute. So the second you start scheduling anything, you should keep a spreadsheet. A tour will live and die by a spreadsheet. I could not keep all this information straight in my head if I were not recording it. So here's just a quick example with columns like date, when that might happen, the day as well. And that might not seem like a big deal, but when you're talking with comic book stores or people that are going to schedule this stuff for you, a lot of time the question will come up, okay, January 7th, is that a Saturday? Oh, actually it's a Thursday. Oh, okay, well, new comic book day is Wednesday, so maybe you want to pull that back by a day or fast forward it to Saturday when people start coming in the store again. So that's helpful to have. And then all the information about the place that's hosting you, name, address, phone number, email, and then also keep track of who you're talking to, and finally, give yourself a section for notes at the end there, because every single contact is going to have some slightly different thing that you need to keep track of, and keep it in a safe place where you'll remember that. So coordinate those initial locations, those friendly stores. And after you do, start to fill in the gaps by making cold calls or cold emails, introducing yourself, telling people about your project. But when you do, now you've got some street cred, and you can say, hey, I'm doing this tour for my new book I'm releasing. I'd love to feature you on my tour, just like Kids Comics Unite and Comics Launch Podcast and whoever else you happen to be, have already scheduled at that time. Because then people see, oh, okay, they're not doing you a favor, you're doing them a favor also by including their name and promoting their store or their website, etc. Okay. So once you've filled in those gaps and you've got your tour solidified, you're not done. You got to let everybody know about it too. Promotion is the name of the game. And I've been doing this promotion of this new book of mine for a couple months now, where I am releasing something new on social media every single day of this campaign, either talking about the new book or the fact that it's launched or that there's a new media outlet or a new stretch goal. But essentially this 31 stops in 31 days tour that I'm doing gives me at least something to talk about every single day of the campaign, instead of, hey, please go buy my book, please go buy my book, please go buy my book. It's, a little different way of getting the word out in the world. So here that is. And I thought I'd wrap this up by saying another thing that is helpful when you're on a tour, either in person or online, is to check in with the stops a few days or a week in advance. And I say this because I've had some folks not remember that I was coming into their shop, which is kind of understandable if you think about it. I'm organizing this tour literally months in advance. And then months down the line, I show up and the retailer is doing their retailer thing, which is ordering books and trying to stay afloat, and is not probably thinking of indie comics guy who's going to show up. And then he's got an employee working that day who was not told about this event. Okay, so that was embarrassing for me. So I hope that you can learn from my embarrassing past experiences and simply pick up the phone or shoot a quick email to check in and say, hey, comic book store A, or hey, media outlet B, just touching base to see, make sure we're all on the same page. Looking forward to our conversation in a week on January 7th or whenever it happens to be. And they'll write back, yes, definitely, of course. And that's a whole lot easier than walking into a store and being told, oh, I guess you could go find a table in the back or something, which has happened to me. And when you do show up prepared, whether it's online or at a store. At a store, you got to be ready to set up at a moment's notice. Get all your product out there in about 10 minutes and show up with your own cash, just in case the store is not going to take credit cards for you. Okay, or in the case of an online event like this, have your presentation ready, have practiced it, understand Zoom or whatever platform you're going to be working on. So that's really important. And one of the last things is to be grateful to whoever is hosting you. If it's an in-store signing, that retailer is giving up valuable retail space that could have been occupied by product that could be making them money. So be thankful of their time and space that they gave you. And I think this is a good reminder for me to say thank you to Jana and Lisa and everybody behind the scenes who has not only allowed me to speak here today, but has also created this incredible community in KCU that, I've felt really fortunate to be a part of these past several months. So Jana, thank you. And finally, repeat that all the way throughout the tour. And don't forget to do any of those things. By the end of your tour, you're going to be zapped. Don't forget to be grateful. Don't forget to be prepared at every single tour stop, because every tour stop is somebody's first impression of you. So that's how I would organize a tour. And if you are interested in grabbing these several steps, I've created a website that you can access at tinyurl.com/how-to-tour. Excuse me. And that's going to take you to a page of my website at elephanteatercomics.com. And every single step that I just outlined for you here today is outlined in this website update. So I'll leave that up there for just a second if you want to jot that down. But ultimately, that's going to do it for my presentation. And I am happy to chat about any questions that you might have and maybe even provide an answer or two. I am only now seeing that there are chats, and I am awful about reading chats. So I hope that if there's any questions in there, somebody might read them to me. Hey, Jana, I think you might be muted.
Sorry, I was muted. Yeah, I said most of the chat was just, oh my gosh, this is amazing. You're amazing.
Oh, thank you so much.
I'm actually not sure if there was a single question so far. People are just stunned into amazement.
Thank you so much, everyone. Hey, Patrick.
But I bet you there are questions. So who has some questions for Ryan?
Ryan.
Yes. Oh, Maritza?
Oops. Hi. Thank you so much. There's so much there for me to absorb, and I'm nowhere near using that info, but I totally have it all noted so I can refer to it later. Hopefully I will need it at some point. My question for you is, when you were showing that part about how you sent out the flats for the color, that was the part that you outsourced, and then it showed really bright colors, and then your colors were different, what you did with it. What's that process about? What's that? How does that?
So when you're digitally coloring line art, there's sort of a couple step process for that. The first step is scanning it in and outlining every different little portion of color. And you have to go in there and select, pasty skin tone, or, white shirt or black seat or whatever it is that's in there, and lay down that flat color. Now that can be anything. It could be green chair and orange skin and green shirt, or whatever it is, so long as the colorist can then come back in and easily single button click that area and then make it whatever color they want. So I do not like doing that first part where I have to tick, 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 tick around that section and tick, 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 tick around the next section. I've done it for many years. I know how to do it, but I'm an old man now, and I am happy to let somebody else do it. So that's the flatting portion. And then I'll take that and make it the colors that I want.
The process of selecting the areas is what they're doing.
Yes, that's right.
Okay.
Yeah, it could even be grayscale. It wouldn't matter what color it is, because then the colorist is just going to take it and do with it what they want.
Okay, cool. Thanks.
You got it.
I have two questions. One of them is personal.
Uh-oh.
You're Bay Area. Are you familiar with the Pinball Museum here in Alameda?
Yes, I am. I've met Michael Scheiss, and yep.
All right, awesome. I walk my dog past it every day.
Yeah.
But second question, speaking of places like the Pinball Museum, what's your most unorthodox venue for your book tours?
Well, my last in-person tour in 2019, I did a tour stop at a planetarium. And I'm going to rewind a little bit. The interview for Coin-Op Carnival was with Wayne Nyans, the most prolific pinball designer of all time. And he is still living today at 103 years old and sharp as a tack. He is an amazing person. So my co-writer and I initially interviewed him over the phone. We had 2 or 3 hours of interview content to work with. And then I started illustrating this interview with him. And when I did that, I would call him up every other week or so. I'd say every couple of weeks I'd give him a call because I'd have some sort of historical question that I wanted to clarify before illustrating something. All that to say, Wayne and I got to become very friendly, which is bonkers for me to say because it's like saying, I'm friends with Michael Jordan, right? It's like the most prolific pinball designer of all time. Like we're on a first name basis. And so I visited Wayne at his home in Mountain Home, Arkansas. This is like a 14-hour drive from where I live in Michigan. But I'm like, he's 100 years old. Like, when am I going to get to do this again? And I was chatting with some folks at the Michigan State University planetarium because I had this wackadoo idea to bring a 360-degree camera and film some conversations with Wayne that could be viewed in a 360-degree environment. So long story short, that's what I did. I got some footage of him explaining and playing his last remaining pinball machine. I also got some footage of him in his home office where he's pointing to each of these frames on the wall with these historically important events and people, and then edited all that together over the course of a number of months. And that was a big book launch for Coin Op Carnival that I did in 2019. So that was a ton of work, but man, it was such a magical night. Patrick, I'll have to send you a link to a bunch of photos documenting that experience. I still get smiles when I remember that night.
Yeah, yes, please. And also follow up. So what would be the two-dimensional zoom-oriented equivalent of that sort of thing? The most unique platform?
So I just did an interview today, which will be aired on the 30th, if my mushy memory serves me correctly, with a watch company in London. And that sounds totally off the beaten path, except for the fact that I have designed a couple of watches for them. It's a company called Mr. Jones Watches. And back in 2020, I think we were all trying to figure out how each of us were going to navigate this isolation, this pandemic that we were all going through. And one of the ways I dealt with that was to launch into a new hobby. Like, I need a hole in the head, but like I started getting really interested in watch collecting, which sounds weird, but it's kind of similar to pinball in that there's mechanics involved. I love understanding how things work. There's also a lot of artistry and design involved. And I ran across this London-based company that was making artist designed watches. And I just fell head over heels in love with them and got a couple of my own, and eventually just said, that's it. I'm going to write this company and introduce myself. Said, hey, I'm Ryan Claytor. Love what you do. Here's what I do. I'd love to work with you sometime. And the company owner, Crispin Jones, wrote back to me the next day and said, hey, just looked at your stuff. We'd love to work with you too. And now a couple designs later, I've shattered their company sellout record with a couple of my designs now. What they do is they release limited edition 100 watch runs first. And if it is well received, then typically they'll move that into their permanent collection. So the first watch I did with them sold out in 2 hours. And then the next watch I did with them, the first watch was in 2020 and the next one was in 2021. That one sold out in 30 minutes. And so I have a joking relationship with one of their best-selling artists. I'm like, all right, now it's your turn. Let's see what you got. He's like, oh, I'll never be able to beat that. He's far outsold me though. So anyway, I'd probably say that a watch manufacturer is the most off the beaten path one I'm thinking of right now.
That's
awesome.
I wish I could come up with a watch pun for you, but I'm just
well, it's about time.
Thank you. So okay, last question. In this context, lead time. What is the most lead time you've had to set up one of these things? And then what is like the least lead time that you've had to set up something like this?
Good question. Okay, so for the 31 stops and 31 days, I was just checking my records, and the first stop that I scheduled, I started talking with them in July or August to set this thing up for January. So that's what, like 4 or 5 months in advance. Now that's crazy lead time. And that's the point at which you need to be speaking with friends. So I know some folks at SoulRad, the comics literary magazine, and one of the founders is part of my Elephant Eater Champions group. And so when I was talking about all these ideas to my super readers, like he was there, and he was one of the first people to say, hey, if you need someone to flagship this thing, we're there. And so that was a very early proponent, but it was also a great feather in my cap, so that every person I contacted thereafter, I could say, just like SoulRad, just like whoever other, media outlet friends of mine I had on board, you can be like them too. I would love to feature you on my tour as well.
Excellent. Well, I think you can guess why I'm asking all these questions. Thanks so much.
I did not have 5 months for every single tour option, though. I know you've got a crowdfunding campaign coming up next month, and it doesn't have to be 31 stops in 31 days. It could be, 3 outlets, and that can be a tour. There is zero shame in that. Like, I've taken a weekend and gone to 2 or 3 different comic book stores and called that a tour. There's no shame in that. So I hope that you don't see Mount Crazy that I have, I'm still trying to ascend over the course of this month, and think that that's how it has to be done. That is absolutely not the case. And it's not where I started either.
Awesome.
Guys, I have to end the call, or I could make somebody else a co-host if you guys feel like there's a few more questions. Is there anybody here who has a burning question?
I'm happy to be a co-host if people want to stick around, and otherwise, I'm happy to let you guys go too.
Should I change? I'm just gonna do it.
And we'll sit with the awkward silence after you're gone.
Yeah, except wait a minute. Why? How can I not? Sorry, guys. I'm having trouble with. Usually Zoom just. Oh, there it is. Okay. Make host. Change host. Okay. Ryan, you're the host now.
Fantastic. Thank you.
So if a few of you want to just keep talking shop, you could do that. I have to go pick up somebody up from a bus stop. But Ryan, thank you so much. This was so awesome.
Thank you,
All
Jana.
right. Bye.
Now on to pinballs.
Before we hit pinball, let's make sure we don't have any more comic questions, because I feel like
I've got a
this is the
question
group
for
for
you.
comics questions.
I've got a question for you, Ryan. First off, that presentation was fantastic. Your energy, your kind of engineer's mind, how you approach everything that you do, from comic making to scheduling. And I see Gareth just got back on. Your spreadsheets kind of rival Gareth's spreadsheets for comic making. I'm just so impressed. But now I've got a question that I'm curious to get your response. I just want you to know the answer is, I think we win either way. And that is, I've always understood that the Billy Ireland comics and cartoon collection was the world's biggest collection at Ohio State University, but you say that now it is MSU. So whose is it really?
Okay, I have an answer to that. Before I forget, you were complimenting my spreadsheet. That URL that I gave you to hop over to my website where the tour stuff is outlined, there is also a sample download spreadsheet where you can grab and then use it for your own tour. So it's all set up exactly as I showed you in that presentation. So before I forget, it's there, it's free. Please take it and use it.
I will do that. Thank you. I appreciate it.
Now for the Battle of the Comics Libraries. We are both the biggest, and here's how that works. MSU is the largest public collection of comic books. The Ohio State University Billy Ireland Cartoon Art Museum is the largest collection of comic strips. So they have a ton of flat files, a ton of original artwork, a ton of strips that we just do not have the capacity to hold, but we've got a ton of bookshelves and that we can hold. So we're actually very friendly with one another. We are not at odds. We do not claim each other's territory. In fact, there's a number of instances where donors will bring a bunch of strips our way or original artwork our way, and we'll be like, this is great, thank you, but you might want to head down the road because that's where they've got the facilities to hold all this stuff. And likewise, when they get a giant collection of comic books, they'll kind of point up to MSU, and each institution has their own strength.
Great, fantastic, Ryan. Actually, one other question you're making me think as you were talking about this. I'm really fascinated by your comic scholar convention that you put on. Who's the lineup for this year, and when is that happening?
Okay, so the Michigan State University Comics Forum has been an annual event for the past 14 years. However, in 2021, I made an announcement about that shifting slightly, and maybe I can share a screen and give you a graphic to look at because I am a visual learner. So let's see if I can pull this up relatively quickly. Okay, here we go. comicsforum.msu.edu. Let me share this screen. Okay, so here's our website, comicsforum.msu.edu will get you right here, and it outlines the annual schedule changes. So basically, like I said, after 14 consecutive years, we are moving to a triennial event because there is a National Comic Studies Society. This is a national conference that typically travels the country, but Michigan State University has partnered with the Comic Studies Society to bring them to Michigan State University every third year. So in 2022, the Comic Studies Society conference is going to take place, and basically the MSU Comics Forum is moving to a triennial event as well. So in 2021, the forum, 2022, Comic Studies Society, and in 2023, we are going to have an invited guest. It's not going to be the huge multi-day event like we usually have for the Comics Forum, but we're going to bring a noted author cartoonist to campus. And then that will repeat. So Comics Forum, CSS, invited guests, Comics Forum, CSS, invited guest. Okay. So that's kind of how our event is working moving forward.
Great, I appreciate it. Thank you.
Sure, no problem.
I had another 2 questions. You didn't, I may have missed it, but I wondered if your grandfather is still living, if he was able to see it printed. Not okay. Sorry.
Nope. No, he passed away in the 90s, so he's been gone for a while, but he left behind this body of work that has really resonated with me. And yeah, I wish he was around for me to show it to him. I get a little reaction, maybe a sense of his reaction, I should say, from my dad, who I've been sharing all these pages with. And he says he can't wait for the book to come out so he can brag about his dad and his son all at once.
Cool. Oh, that's awesome. I'm sure it's really going to be amazing for your son too, to have that kind of heritage. That's really awesome.
Thank you.
My other question was, you talked about coming from the fine arts background and like that kind of education and stuff. And that's what I'm experiencing too. And is there any more thing? I mean, you've been doing comics forever. So, well, you know, forever. Yeah, just in that, if you can think back to what that was like, because I'm trying to still like orient my mind around how I'd put together what I'm doing. So,
yeah. So correct me if I'm wrong, but I think you're asking
anything in regards to whatever comes to mind for you. Yeah.
I don't know if there's a perfect education for any of us out there. You know, I really appreciate having a fine art background and really being forced to think considerably and critically about the work that I make and what kind of a theme or message I want to put out into the world.
Right.
But at the same time, there's a part of me that wishes like, oh, I'll bet those illustration programs over there really talked about fundamentals of proportion and figure drawing. And yeah, I had a couple classes, but like I still feel a little behind the curve in terms of that sort of skill. But there's so many online classes these days.
Right.
There's so many YouTube tutorials these days. There's just an infinite number of ways to get that sort of work under your belt. And
Yeah.
of course, practice, practice, practice. In the before times, I would have said, hey, find a figure drawing studio session around where you live, because there's no substitution for just drawing the human figure over and over and over again. And I did that as long as I could, and I don't do that during the pandemic right now. I still don't feel comfortable, and that's beside the point. But there's other ways to do that online as well. There's figure drawing sites online. You can even set up a particular amount of time that each image is shown to you, and it happens independently so that you can keep drawing. So I would set yourself up on a regimen of improving a thing. Like each project that I've done has focused on improving something, like that autobiographical conversations book I mentioned, where I started including a lot more environments. You saw in my prior work to that, there wasn't much in the way of environments. So I'm like, gosh darn it, I'm doing environments, and whether they're decent or not, they're going to be in that book. So that was like an opportunity for me to feel more comfortable drawing environments. My next book, Coin Op Carnival, I have a very difficult time drawing interlocking items, and like even to the point of like if it's people hugging and like limbs are wrapping around each other, like that's very difficult for me in my mind to parse. And I was doing a book about electromechanical games, which have a bajillion interlocking parts. So I'm like, okay, throwing myself in the deep end. And there are pages in that book where I've done full color, full blown diagrammatic explosions of relays and how they interconnect and form together. And I had to understand how those work before I was able to even think about drawing them. But the reward for that came when there were old timers, electromechanical technicians that picked that book up at the book release. We released our book at the Texas Pinball Festival in Frisco, Texas, which is the largest pinball festival in North America. And a guy bought it on day one. It's in a hotel. He read it overnight, came back to me the next day, and he's like, I wish I had this when I was learning how to do electromechanical tech. And he pointed to these like diagrammatic explosions that I had drawn that absolutely blew up my brain trying to draw those. But I was determined to make something accurate, because we want this document to be something that people can pick up and say, oh, okay, I see that in my machine. I understand how that works. I can adjust it now. I can make my own games work based on these drawings. It's not just a flippant sketch. It's a researched illustration. So all that to say, I would pick one thing that you want to
throw
work
yourself
on.
in the deep end with it.
and find a project that's important to you that you can work on that with. And allowing that to go into the world. So then you've got a product. It's not just a bunch of hidden pages. I mean, those can exist too if you're trying to practice, but really try to focus on that one thing. And then for the next project, think about the next thing that you might not be so comfortable with.
Yeah. Awesome. Thank you.
You got it. Gareth, I've seen your hand a couple times.
Yeah, I just had a couple of quick ones. When you do the blue lining that you're going to ink over, are you just doing that in Photoshop and printing it out in blue?
Yes, I'm doing it in Clip Studio Paint and printing it out in blue. That's exactly right.
Yep. Inkjet.
Yes. So I've got like an oversized, my office is a mess, but I've got an oversized
Yep.
all-in-one printer, scanner, whatever, right next to me. And it does all of those things in a very marginal way, but all I need from it is to be able to print out blue. Like it's not a giclée print hanging on the wall. It's just enough for me to ink over. And it takes 11 inches wide, a little more than 11 inches wide, so I can fit sizable pieces of Bristol through there. And it's also top fed. So yes, it has a tray, but those trays are going to curl that paper, and Bristol doesn't like to do that. So if you can find a top fed printer that allows it to feed through, you can usually jam your Bristol through an inkjet printer that way.
Yep. And are you drawing your speech balloons right into the art?
Yes. So that, in retrospect, I probably should have picked a different page with some speech balloons to show you, but I create my speech balloons in Adobe Illustrator and lay out the text and the balloons and everything on that initial layout. And then I bring that into Clip Studio Paint, where I will illustrate characters, environments, everything inside the panels that is not the balloon. And then print that out, ink everything by hand, scan it back in.
Cool. Thank you.
Yeah, you got it. Thanks for asking.
I have a quick question about publishing. Do you think that you'll always stay with Elephant Eater, or do you think you'll submit future projects to the huge publishing companies?
I have very strong opinions about this. And you can probably guess what they are. I wish Jana was here to balance me on this, because I feel heartened because I've heard Jana say, I love self-publishing. I love when people self-publish their work. So I feel like we're not too awfully removed, but here are my feelings on that. I will always self-publish. I used to feel a particular way about self-publishing when I was early in my career. I felt like I haven't really been accepted or vetted into comics, because I wasn't published by a known publisher. I was self-publishing my work. But the more time marches on, the more cartoonists I talk to, the more high-profile cartoonists I talk to, and I've had the privilege of talking with a lot of them at this point. As the director of the Michigan State University Comics Forum, I get to invite my heroes to campus. I can name a laundry list. I'll let you guys go to the MSU Comics Forum website and see who all has been here. But all that to say, I hear so many stories about creators who, in some way, shape, or form, are done wrong by publishers. And again, I wish Jana were here to balance this out. Maybe we can have a discussion about this at some point, but either contracts are signed in a way that relegates the rights to the publisher in a way that they keep them in perpetuity if the publication is kept in print. And I have heard cases where in print is like, oh, we've tossed it on Comixology and people can buy a digital version if they want. So that's in print. So you can no longer take your intellectual property and do whatever you want to with it. It's ours. And we say you cannot do it. Other stories with intellectual property A anymore. So that's a big bummer. I've heard horror stories about publishers grossly underprinting books and artists not being able to have their own books. I've heard horror stories of creators being grossly shorted what they are due for their book. And I don't know. I think that when you approach a publisher, the publisher is essentially gambling on you that your work is going to sell. And when they do that, they try to hedge their bets as much as possible, which is understandable. But one of the things publishers want from a creator is for you to come to them with an established fan base. Like, how many followers do you have? How many Instagram followers do you have? How many Twitter, Facebook, et cetera, followers do you have? Oh, okay, that's up to snuff. So come on over here. And when we publish your book, we want you to promote the hell out of it. Okay, well, if I'm going with a publisher, what are they doing for me besides pressing the go button on the print machine and footing the printing bill? I can do that. Like, that's pretty easy. And if I have spent years, decades cultivating a fan base that I am going to have to leverage anyway for someone else to make the majority of the money off what I produced over the past months, years of my life, I'm sorry, I'm not going to do that. I understand there are benefits and detractors to having somebody else publish your work. Not everybody is comfortable talking print to printers. I will say that printers are comfortable talking print with uncomfortable print folks. So I tell my students all the time, don't be afraid to ask questions. Nobody fully understands print, but you can say, hey, this is a book that I like. Can we make mine look like this? It's saddle stitched, or it's perfect bound, or it's 32 pages, or it's 84 pages, or what? Can we make this happen? And the printer will look at it and say, yes, let me drop a quote for you. And then you can see how much it's going to cost to print. And ultimately, at the end of the day, for me, my interests in cartooning are so weird and niche. A comic book about autobiographical theory as it relates to comics, a book about antiquated technology and its history, a poem that my grandfather wrote 40 years ago that's published in this unpublishably tiny size. Like, nobody's going to touch that with a 10-foot pole, but I want to, and I've managed to create an audience for it and have some successful launches of them. My current book is still being launched as we speak, but let's just take Coin Op Carnival, for example. Weird niche product. It's not even fully a comic book. It's like 20% comic book, right? But we did an initial print run of 1,000 books, and we set up that 16-stop tour that I showed you. We thought that would last us through that tour and beyond. We were sold out of 1,000 copies of that book well before that tour even finished. In the middle of the tour, I was coordinating with the printer saying, hey, we need to do a second printing. So at this point, there are 2,100 copies of Coin Op Carnival in the world. And we just got Diamond distribution, where I sent another several hundred copies out to be distributed to comic shops all over the US. So we're down to like slim pickings on our second printing of that book. So in all likelihood, we're going to have to go to a third printing of that book where we keep, the entire profit of selling that book. And I think I'm also passionate about this because people very close to me have been affected by this. My wife has published a book, an incredible book, this past year. And this is how much she's seen in return from 20 years of working on a book. I've already made God knows how many more dollars than she has from this Kickstarter that's been up for 2 weeks, self-publishing my own book. So anyway, that's a big long-winded way to say I have big feelings about self-publishing. And to answer your question shortly, I cannot imagine ever not self-publishing.
Thanks so
Amen.
much. Yeah, I really appreciate that thorough answer and sharing your opinions and not holding back.
You got it. And again, I would love to talk with Jana about this. She works at big pubs, and there are sincerely good reasons to go with a big publisher. I am not a household name. I understand that. Like, I would wager the majority of you here have not heard of Ryan Claytor, the cartoonist, right? I'm a self-publisher. It's a little bit smaller gig, but if I were published by Random House, I'd have a name. So there are reasons to go with a big pub. I would just urge everyone to be very careful if you do.
One thing that comes to mind based on what you said brought to my mind was something like a question of how much if you're leveraging your day job to be able to take the risks that are involved in self-publishing and that sort of thing. Would it be different for a dentist, you know?
Heck yeah, it would. Yeah, that's a really great question. And I am not making a full-time living as a cartoonist, but that's also by design. Like I'm a teacher, and there was a point in time in which I tried to do each thing on its own. Like I tried just teaching for a while, and that left me feeling a little empty creatively. And I've tried to have my own creative business, a graphic design business before, and that also left me feeling a little itchy to like get back and share what I know with people, because I like people. I like talking with people. I like sharing knowledge. I like the exchange. And I felt like that was missing. And so for me, I've crafted this way of life where I teach, but I also make, and it's this nice symbiotic relationship. One feeds the other. I feel like when I teach, I learn, and I'm understanding how to make comics better. When I'm making comics, I'm learning new things that I can then bring back to my time in the classroom. It keeps me present. It keeps me engaged. It keeps me current. So I don't know, for me, it's the happy medium. But in answer to your question, yes, teaching also provides some stability. And I understand that I am in a privileged position because of that and many other reasons. So yes, that definitely affects the bottom line of what you're able to do. But I think that this whole crowdfunding thing has given us all a tremendous opportunity to make what we want. So Patrick, I know you've got a book coming out soon, and I don't know how much you've thought about like printing or what you want the book to look like, or like the minimum look of your book, or like the pie in the sky dream of your book. So maybe, excellent, nice. So maybe like the first goal that you have, your funding goal, is the paperback version. Maybe a stretch goal is a hardback version or an expanded version with more pages that you wanted to include, or I don't know what. But if the audience is there, you might be able to do it not out of pocket at all, which is not how I was operating 20 years ago when I first started doing this thing. You know, I was hand printing, hand folding, hand stapling, hand making every single book, walking them into comic book shops and saying, is there any chance you might carry my book in your store? And even if they did, I was typically doing it on consignment in hopes that maybe one day I'd see some return on something like this. But I've had students of mine as recent as like this month have successful crowdfunding campaigns, to the point where like one of my students who launched their very first comic book on Kickstarter got $2,500 for their first comic book. And again, if you rewound 20 years and said to 20-something-year-old Ryan, hey, in 20 years, you could make a comic book, your very first one, and, you know, make a whole bunch of money, a lot more than you're making right now. I would have thought you were crazy. But even just this past year, my 7-year-old son, he's 8 years old now, he was 7 at the time, made his first comic book. This is completely of his own volition, but of course, very proud papa. And he comes to me and he's like, Daddy, I want to take this comic book around the neighborhood and sell it to people. And I told him, ordinarily, that would be a really great idea, and I'd love to help you out with that. But pandemic times, COVID, yada, yada, not a great time to do that. But I've got another idea. We might be able to sell it online. And there's this thing called Kickstarter. So we made a campaign for his very first comic book. We planned to print his comic on my my home printer here. We thought maybe, a handful of people, friends, relatives might pick it up. We'd make, I don't know, 10 copies, 20 if we were lucky. So we made this ridiculously low funding goal. And the first day, like 100 people bought my son's first comic book. By the end of the campaign, he had well over 300 backers. And when everything was said and done, even after paying for, so like, it was very obviously very quick that I was not going to be able to print this on my home printer. So I called up my printer and I'm like, I got a thing here. Can you help me? And he's like, yes, we can do that. So anyway, after factoring in printing costs, shipping packaging costs, everything, we socked away over a couple $1,000 in his college fund because my son made his first comic book and we launched it on a Kickstarter. It's like this incredible democratization of comics distribution. These projects that wouldn't see the light of day otherwise are gaining traction. And it's all about bringing your audience to the campaign. If you can show Kickstarter on that first day, hey, I mean business, and you can get a fair number of backers, you start moving up in their rankings, they start promoting you to their folks, and it snowballs. So.
Well, you mentioned neighborhood distribution and like stapling together the book yourself and a day one Kickstarter. And I just feel like I must shout out Stephanie, who ticks all of those boxes and is on this call right now.
Awesome.
Patrick, you weren't supposed to. But thank you. But no, it's been a wonderful pleasure watching your project kickstart. I was a total backer, and then hearing your wonderful presentation, working it. I respect the hustle, the precise, intelligent, mobilize your networks. So thank you so much for sharing your tips, and heartfelt, because I have to say, A, I backed it because I love Patrick. B, because all about share and networks. But then the heartfelt hearing this is a tribute to your grandfather. Just my heart melted, and then everything else. So yes, taking notes. Thank you, Patrick.
Thank you, Stephanie.
Drop your link in the text, Stephanie, so those of us here who are hearing about it the first time.
I will do that. I'm going to see if I can multitask on my phone and figure that out as I fold laundry and all that. I'm going to get you that link.
Thanks so much, Stephanie. Thanks for all the kind words and for backing, and it's good to see your face.
Who else has a Kickstarter here?
I was considering one, but I haven't really gotten as far in my project as I had hoped, because working with KCU right now, kind of building the website and everything. So honestly, it's been super helpful and a blast just listening to you, Ryan, honestly. As someone who's just kind of began creating comics last September, I think, or no, maybe it's been a little longer. No, it's been a year. Oh my gosh, 21 for some reason, like it was time slip. It was back in 2020, so it's been a year. Yeah. Over a year now.
Well,
but I began that long ago. Yeah, so I'm kind of new.
I was going to say, don't feel bad if a project has taken you a little longer than you thought it might. I thought I was going to launch A Hunter's Tale in November. In fact, some of the first 2, 3, 4 tour contacts that I chat with, I said, this is launching in November. And it became apparent in relatively short order that that wasn't going to happen. I did not want to launch in December because I didn't want to be tied up during the holidays. So I just said, okay, we're going to push this to January. So all that to say, don't sweat it. Comics take a long time. It's okay. It's going to be great when it comes out. Keep working on it.
Thank you. And I'll definitely be probably picking up all your books, because I'm always super fascinated about just theory generally in terms of comics. I love peeking under the hood of just the medium itself. So I have a lot of homework ahead of me, and I'm
cool. Thank you so much, Jade. I appreciate it.
I have one more question. Is there it's probably like a simple one, but like what comics are you like super inspiring to you right now? Like,
Yeah. Let's see. How much time do you have? So
I know we're going long.
I really love the work of Craig Thompson, and he's coming out with this comic right now called Ginseng Roots. And, you know, Craig Thompson is usually like hibernate for a decade and then drop some giant epic on the industry. But this is a different beast in that he is serializing this book in floppy comic book form, and it's coming out periodically through Uncivilized Books. I've got a subscription to it, so it just shows up on my doorstep every once in a while when the next one's ready. So I'm really enjoying Ginseng Roots, which is about, you know, him growing up in rural Wisconsin and ginseng farming, and how that has become this global center for ginseng, and what that means with different people related to it with regard to farming and the Hmong community that's surrounding that. And it's incredibly interesting. Anyway, I'm enjoying that. I also really like Isle of Elsie. This is a web comic for kids that's put out by a cartoonist buddy of mine named Alec Longstreth. And if you go to Isle of Elsie, that's a palindrome. So Isle, Isle, I-S-L-E, of Elsie. Elsie is Isle spelled backwards. There's a lot of wordplay in the comic. So isleofelsie.com will take you straight there. And he comes out with a new full color page of comics every single week. And every week my son and I will read that together. And it's a really fantastic strip. Lisa, thank you for putting that in the chat.
That is so cool. I'm looking at it right now.
Cool.
I love it.
Yeah, me too. So those are probably a couple I'd point to, but I love the work of Sergio Aragonés. I'll go back to my Guru the Wanderer collection frequently. I still buy every issue of Usagi Yojimbo by Stan Sakai. I know, lots of great folks out there.
Thank you.
That's awesome. Yeah, I still want to dive into like your thoughts on audience and then like what you've been saying about, and you know, stop me at any time, but I'm free today and until my call, which is at around 5. But
yeah,
you know, I really want to. I'm really loving what you've been saying about like knowing your audience, or like coming to a Kickstarter with your audience. You know.
Yeah. So I too have to roll at 4 o'clock Eastern. I have a university class I need to teach, so I've got about 20 minutes here. But yeah, as far as an audience is concerned, that is what makes a Kickstarter campaign successful. Like, you don't just launch it and then hope that Kickstarter points people toward it. Like, you got to bring people. And how do you do that? Well, you know, I've very early in my career, I started conventioneering, you know, showing my work at conventions. And I feel very lucky that a person in my life at the time said, you should start collecting email addresses. And at the time I'm like, that sounds dirty. Like, I don't want to do that. Like, no, it doesn't have to be anything, any pressure involved. You just put a list out there, and if people want to sign up for it, they'll do it. Like, okay, I guess that's not too bad. So I did that. And people who are interested in my work, they're like, oh, what's this? And I said, oh, I send out a quarterly email list. It's bi-monthly now. And like, oh, that'd be great. So they'll sign up. And I'm now like 1,500 email addresses strong after, you know, asking people for an email address for, you know, almost 20 years. And like, that's a reasonable group that you can bring to the table and say, hey, I've got a new thing. Like, over the course of the years, it's lots of like, hey, here's what I'm working on. Here's free stuff. Here's what I'm thinking about. But then after you give them, your audience, a lot of free content, they're like, yes, I'm ready for this token of payment, you know, like, so an email list is key, I would say. I think it's probably the biggest and best thing that any creator can do, is to start forming an email list now. And when 2020 hit, I was no longer going to conventions. I still have not been to a convention since, 2020. So I've not been able to collect email addresses. So I started thinking about ways I could. I looked at my social media accounts, said, okay, well, I've got 1,600 Facebook friends. I'm sure a few of them are on my email list, but I'm sure not all of them. And so there was a month during 2020 where I systematically went through my Facebook friends and individually emailed every single one of them over the course of that month. And I got probably a 20% return on people that I emailed. Not everybody's gonna be interested. Not everybody's gonna respond to you, but a percentage will. And a percentage of that are going to help you bring your projects to fruition. So,
What did you say in those emails?
I could pull one up, but I think the gist of it was,
I'll see you.
hey,
Bye, Robert.
see you, Robert. Thanks for hanging out.
Hi, Robert.
This is like a marathon.
Yeah. Right. So I think the gist of it was, hey, I hope 2020 is treating you okay. I know it's been a rough one. It's been a lot of different things for a lot of different people. And for me, it's meant not going to conventions, which has, cleaved my income. But on top of that, I'm also not getting new people signing up for my email address, which I'd like to ask you about. I create comics. Most people on my friends list know that I do this, but I create comics, and I'd love to have you on my email list. I send it out, you say the periodic time so that people can say, yes, I want a daily update, or no, that's too much for me. So I send mine out every other month typically, and I'll say I send this out every other month. Here's a sign up form link. And if you're interested, you can sign up there. So kind of short and sweet, letting people know about what it is, and they can make their own decision. And that was it. And it was kind of cool because a lot of it was like a catalyst for getting back in touch with people in my life. So literally going through my entire Facebook friend group. And then it's like, oh, hey, I haven't heard from you forever. And oh gosh, what have you been up to? And it's a lot of like correspondence after that, which you have to also love, which I do. I like talking with people. So it was nice to catch up with a bunch of folks in my life. Yeah. So that's why I say it took me like a solid month to get through that many Facebook friends. I had delusions of going through Twitter and going through Instagram as well, but I haven't made it that far yet.
Well, I just did some math, and 1,500 subscribers over 20 years is about 75 a year. So that's like that's an attainable goal.
Totally. And with you bringing that up, I got probably about 250 new subscribers by combing my Facebook friends group in a month. And at the time, I was floored. I did the same math that you did, Patrick. And I said, this is like multiple years of conventioneering that happened in this condensed amount of time. And it really opened my mind to a different way of doing things, because I was very much about in-store signings, in-person things, in-person conventions, but I'm still not ready for that. And there are viable alternatives to make that happen.
Amazing. Yeah. I'm coming on a year on my first mailing list, and that's, I think, around 125 right now. And then the second one, which is specific to my Tiger's Tail project, which I launched 6 months ago.
Mm-hmm.
That one's at about 75. So
yeah, one of the things I coach my students through, so in my advanced comics class, I give them an option to be coached through a Kickstarter campaign. And not all of them take me up on it. And understandably, it's a ton of work. And so is creating a comic, which they have to do that semester as well. But long story short, one of the things I have my students do if they take me up on that offer is to get 10 email addresses every week over the course of the semester. And then by the time they launch their campaign, they've got 100 email addresses and 100 people they've been corresponding with every 2 or 3 weeks or so, updating them about the status of the project, taking them on this journey with them. And then when it launches, you have that core group of people that are going to support you on day one, which is so important in crowdfunding terms.
Awesome.
Yeah.
This has been amazing, Ryan. I mean, this is like, I don't know if people know, this seems to be like the crowning jewel of your tour so far, just these extra. I mean,
thanks, Patrick. I appreciate that. It's so nice to finally chat with you virtually in person. I know we've been exchanging messages online and seeing what each other have been doing, but it's nice to finally talk and
oh yeah,
and put some more faces to the KCU landscape too. This is really cool.
Absolutely. And one thing I'm like kind of curious about later is we should do like something specifically about like crowdfunding or crowdsourcing, some big subject matter, like a topic, because it is like a big debate of publishing versus self-publishing. And I would love to hear more about that, and like maybe you and like just a panel.
Well,
and it'd be
Debate?
super,
Would it be a debate?
yeah, I mean, it'd be so great to hear.
I was thinking something more like a post-op, like looking back at, considering where things started in July, August. This is some insider baseball talk, right? But like the initial stuff that KCU did or KCS did on Kickstarter, right? Like now we need to go back and look back at Lex's campaign, at James Powell's campaigns, at Ryan, and then just like really look at similarities and differences, right? What makes a holistic campaign?
Yeah, that's a good idea. I attended Lex's KCU presentation that he did. I think it was it shortly after? I think it was in between the Tarpeian Rock and Hama the Pig. I think he did it right in between there. But yeah, I was just so impressed with the quality of attendees that were there and asking really intelligent questions, and also really impressed with Lex's presentation, and felt like, all right, if I'm going to do this, I really need to bring my A game. So I was trying to live up to what Lex started there. I thought he did a really fantastic job.
Oh, like a duck to water,
No, these have been like stellar.
Your turn, Patrick. We're ready. We're ready for
That's
your
right.
presentation. Your Kickstarter
I
launch.
might as well be a stand-up improv routine.
Oh man. Well, I'm looking forward to your campaign launching. Do you have a launch date for it, Patrick?
February 1st, the
First.
beginning of Lunar New Year, Year of the Tiger.
Almost there.
Yeah.
Hey, Patrick,
Mhm.
I'm gonna do a final day live stream for my campaign on January 31st. And I'm gonna live stream this to Facebook. And I'm gonna bring in like different creators and media outlet folks and people that I've talked to along the way on this tour, and have like, sort of a Zoom talk show type of thing. And each person is going to be on for like 10 minutes and, talk about my campaign, talk about what they're doing. Do you want to come on for 10 minutes on this final
110%.
thing?
Yes, do it, Patrick.
10%, yeah.
Go, go,
Awesome.
go.
Awesome. Let's
I've been like trying to model your tour, and what the side effect is that I'm getting a couple of interviews, but what's resulting is I'm interviewing a bunch of people, so I've interviewed some Kung Fu masters. I interviewed a martial artist who's broken the Guinness Book of World Records 53 times.
Wow.
You
That's so
All
cool.
these-
And
No, so it's just like I have to kind of build a platform for these people who want to support my project, but they don't have a platform of their own. So kind of an inversion of what I've seen you do. It's kind of nuts.
totally. And I'm trying to do similar things as well. Like I don't know how closely you've been following the inordinate amount of updates I've been putting out from the Kickstarter, but there is a cartoonist buddy of mine named Don Wynn, and he pointed me toward probably about 10% of the stops on my tour this time around, because I contacted way more than 31 people to get those 31 stops, of course. So I was contacting everybody in my network, and I said, hey, Don, do you know of any media outlets that might want to talk about this work of mine? And he said, boom, 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 and outlined a few of them. Like, oh my God, this is incredible. And so I don't know if I would have got to 31 without Don. And Don is a cartoonist in his own right. And so I interviewed Don on my Patreon podcast, and then, allowed my patrons to experience that first. And then a week or two later, I opened that up to a public post and then told everybody on my Kickstarter campaign about it. I said, hey, this is Don, big headshot of him. And this is what he produces, big cover image of his work. And Don is an incredible cartoonist and responsible for 10% of this tour that I keep talking about. So please go to his page and, and here's an interview with him. And I did that for Dua Chaka Her as well. She is a Hmong American artist, and it's her book called Traditions that was this tiny size, 4 1/8 by 5 1/4. And when I got done reading that book, I literally took out a ruler and measured 4 1/8 by 5 1/4. That's the size I want my book. Hey, printer, can we make this happen? Yes, we can print that. Okay, that's the size of A Hunter's Tale. So I got in touch with Dua and I said, hey, I'm doing this campaign. You were a big inspiration for the format of my book. Can we do an interview? And I interviewed her again on my Patreon page, and then opened it up and just released it today to the public. So again, I'm trying to spotlight other artists as well and try to spread that love. And so I really admire what you're doing. And I'm super interested in it. I want to hear an interview with a Guinness World Record breaking martial artist.
He can catch arrows blindfolded. I've seen the footage.
No way. Oh my God.
What is it? The most number of punches thrown, faster than Bruce Lee, faster than Muhammad Ali.
Oh my gosh.
But okay,
that's insane.
Here's the thing is that his greatest accomplishment that he thinks that when I ask him what's his greatest accomplishment, it's helping his 13-year-old student get over social anxiety.
Cool.
Oh, that's awesome.
So cool.
His whole vision is to be the world's greatest coach. To have 60 world records to prove it,
That's really neat. Wow.
So
it's incredible. Well, I can't wait.
I'm just excited to talk to someone like that,
Yeah, for sure. I'm excited to read an interview like that or listen to an interview like that, however you're releasing it.
Well, yeah, I got him on Zoom. So he cool. turns the camera around and you can see the wall of all of it, of his awards, of his records. So
nice. That's impressive.
But yeah, he likes my art. So hooray, that's one fan,
Very cool. Very cool. When it's pretty gratifying when you get those occasional hero attaboys, right? Sergio Aragonés is on my Mount Rushmore of cartoonists, right? I've loved his work for a very long time. And I remember one time I've since brought him to campus and hung out with him and just feel so lucky to have been able to do that. But I remember in my early cartooning days, I was set up at a table and I had this poster version, this broadsheet of a comic that I did. And it was about my dad and I. And I stopped him and I said, hey, Sergio, and introduced myself. And he took a look at this big thing on my table and he sat there and he read it. And, it's 20 panels. So it took a minute and he really took his time. And when he was done, he's like, wow, that's really tender. And it was such a perfect affirmation for what I was trying to do at the time. It was just oh, still makes me tear up today. Even thinking of that, it's really cool.
That's awesome. Oh yeah. Those moments, right? That kind of help you along the way, I guess, right?
Yeah.
You may not recognize them in the moment because you're so in the moment, but then you could look back and be like, oh, I got over that hump because I got that nudge back there by so and so.
Totally. Yeah. It's interesting to sort of look back and see how meaningful some of those little interactions can be. It's cool.
Mhm.
Thank you so much, Ryan. This was amazing.
You got it. Thank
This
you,
is-
Lisa. Thanks for setting all this up. I appreciate all your work behind the scenes.
Yeah, of course. We'll see you around.
Cool. Take
I'll
care.
be in touch with you, Ryan.
Okay. Awesome. I should
And you
probably
too,
head out
and you
too
too,
for
Melissa.
class. Thanks
Bye.
everybody for sticking around.
See ya.
Thank you.
See ya.
Bye.